Criminology is a true crime podcast that may contain discussion about violent or disturbing topics. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 348 of the Criminology podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
Mr. Morford, what's going on with you, buddy?
A little bit busy this week. I'm launching a new podcast called Killer Communications that comes out this Saturday, the same day as our episode. So hopefully listeners will come over and check it out.
All right, well, give us a little preview. What are we talking about here?
Well, it's all about cases where somebody sends a letter or a phone call or an email, text. Even some of the older cases might even be something like a telegram. So it's pretty interesting, and it goes on a lot more than you would think. So I'm pretty excited about it.
All right, sounds good. You've got me hooked. I like cases where the killer communicates. So I will definitely check it out.
Yeah, I'd love it.
We had one new Patreon member this week, and that was Reed. So appreciate the support.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. You rock, and everyone else that helps support the show. It means a lot to us. For anyone else that would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/criminology to get started.
All right, let's jump right in. And if you listened to last week's episode about Steven Stayner, then you got a bit of a heads up that we're going to cover his brother this week, Cary Stayner, while Steven Stayner went on to become a hero after being abducted as a child and later escaping and saving another boy in the process. Steven's older brother, Cary, went on to achieve just the opposite. He became infamous for the callous and cold-blooded crimes that he committed. And by the end of this episode, most listeners will probably be asking, how can two brothers turn out so very differently?
Cary Stayner was born on August 13th, 1961. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner. His only brother, Steven, was born 4 months before he turned 4. There was one girl born in between them and another 2 girls after Steven. The Stayner family lived in Merced in California's San Joaquin Valley. For many years, their life there was pretty normal. Kay worked at a daycare, and Delbert worked at a cannery, which during harvest time meant 18-hour days, 6 days a week. As we talked about in the last episode, Steven would be abducted and held captive for years before escaping, and his abduction certainly didn't help Cary's makeup. But the truth is, he was likely already on his way to becoming that person even before Steven was abducted.
Cary showed signs of what seemed like anxiety pretty early in his life. He was diagnosed with trichotillomania, a disorder that involves compulsively pulling out your own hair, when he was just 3 years old. This is really early for any kind of mental health diagnosis, but the bald patches all over his head made it clear that something wasn't right. He was prescribed medication for the condition, but he would continue to struggle with this disorder as he grew up. This would prove to be just one of many struggles for Cary when he was a young boy, when he was around 7 years old. About 3 years after being diagnosed with trichotillomania, he began to have thoughts about kidnapping and killing women. Just a few years after he began to have these fantasies, a kidnapping hit close to home.
On December 4th, 1972, Cary's 7-year-old brother Steven Stayner was abducted by Kenneth Parnell on his walk home from school. This day changed everything for the entire Stayner family, including Cary, who was 11 at the time. His parents were broken, just devastated. They tried their best to keep their family together as normal as possible, but they weren't the same people anymore. Steven's abduction had changed them. When Kenneth Parnell kidnapped Steven, he stole the innocence of all 5 of the Stayner children at the same time, and perhaps Delbert and Kay Stayner focused a lot of their attention on their missing son, and not as much on the kids that were there with them. That's not to blame Delbert and Kay for what happened, and it seems likely that a lot of parents of abducted children might focus extra attention on the void that was created.
It was this same year that Steven first went missing that Cary would later say he was molested by his uncle. After this, his fantasies about women began to get increasingly violent, sadistic, and sexual. Cary always felt overshadowed by Steven. Even while he wasn't there in the Stayner home, everything was about him. Holidays became about Steven and were no longer joyous. After Steven was abducted, the Stayner family held out hope that he was alive. Every year, his siblings and his parents still bought him Christmas gifts and wrapped them. They waited under the tree on the chance that he would make it home in time to open them on Christmas. I would think it would be very normal in a situation like this where one of your children is abducted, that yes, the focus does become about that. Like that's the biggest thing in your world at that point. Now, in the case of the Stayner family, they had 4 other children. And I think it's an interesting exercise to, kind of think about or try to figure out, what did it do to these 4 other children? And I think in Cary's case, maybe, there was a little bit of jealousy there, anger around the fact that so much attention was being paid to Steven, maybe not as much to him.
Yeah, and I think that anger, that resentment probably wasn't a good mix with those things he was secretly already feeling about hurting women and these fantasies he was having. Probably wasn't a good mix.
But, I think that's part and parcel of a lot of situations that we talk about. Other people have gone through this same thing, having a sibling abducted. Now, maybe not exactly as it occurred with Steven, but they didn't go on to then commit sexual assaults and kill. I think there are people who deal with a lot of different things, but with some of them, there's something already inside them or something that is kind of maybe laying dormant under the surface, and whatever happens, whatever they're dealing with kind of causes it to erupt. And maybe that's what we'll see with Cary.
Despite being the brother of a missing person, Cary didn't get any sympathy from other kids in school. He still had to deal with classmates who would bully him for the bald spots on his head, even well into high school, and he would usually try to wear a baseball cap whenever he could to cover his hair. Some people would even tease Cary, insinuating he had his brother Steven abducted. According to a former classmate of Cary's, Jack Bungart, Steven's abduction made it hard to be anything other than the kid who had his brother kidnapped. Bungart also said prior to the abduction that Cary loved Steven and always spent time with him, playing with him.
In school, Cary was known as mostly quiet, though there was a dark side to him. When he was 16, one of his younger sisters had a sleepover. One of the girls was 14. The night she stayed over at the Stayner house, she recalls Cary creeping into the dark room while she was sleeping and reaching up from underneath her cot to touch her chest. She woke up and told him to leave, but he was only gone for a moment before lingering in the doorway naked. Again, she told him to get out. Finally, he did, but the girl didn't tell Cary's parents. Despite the dark side Cary had and his reserved nature, he seemed to be generally well-liked. Classmates noted how smart he was, and they enjoyed cartoons he made for the school's newspaper. He was voted most creative during his senior year at Merced High.
Almost a year after Cary's graduation, Steven escaped his captor and came home. It had been 7 years since his abduction. We talked in the last episode about how difficult it was for Steven to adjust to being back home, but it was difficult for Cary too. While Steven was suddenly the middle child again, Cary found himself having to share his room with his little brother that he really didn't even know anymore. According to a Time magazine article, author J.P. Miller, who went on to write I Know My First Name is Steven, interviewed Cary after Steven came home. Cary told the author, "I was the oldest and all that. Then all of a sudden, it's gone. I got put on the back burner, you might say." Now with Steven being back home, instead of just being the kid with the missing sibling, Cary was that hero kid's brother. After that, Cary was just never Cary. He was and always would be Steven Stayner's brother.
And I do believe, Morph, that, a lot of people struggle living in the shadow of someone else. Whether you have a famous parent or a famous sibling, that can be difficult for many people. And you can kind of see here in some of the things that Cary said. He used the words back burner. It was almost like, hey, once Steven got home, I didn't matter anymore. I wasn't Cary. I was hero Steven's brother. And you think about, your identity, your self-worth. Okay, what does that do to someone who already may have some issues that they're dealing with?
Yeah, it seems like it's just a recipe for things to boil over and maybe bring some things to the surface.
We talked about how the Stayners may have been consumed with their grief about Steven being missing, that maybe they didn't perhaps focus enough attention on their other kids. Now with Steven back, they focused their attention on Steven even more. Cary Stayner told People magazine, "There's a lot of things I wish we'd done differently." One of Cary and Steven's sisters, Court, told People magazine, "A lot of attention went to Steven. We all got a little jealous." While Steven was hailed as a hero by the community, Cary seemed to downplay his brother's bravery, knocking it down to common decency. According to People magazine, he once said, "The way I see it, just about anyone would have done the same thing in his shoes."
As an adult, Cary lived with his Uncle Jerry and worked a series of odd jobs that never lasted very long. He worked for an aluminum company for a while, did some pest control work, and spent time hauling furniture. He bounced around at different glass companies. It's not clear how close he got with his brother Steven, but in 1989, Steven was riding his motorcycle home from work when a car turned in front of him. His motorcycle impacted with the car and he died from his injuries. The driver was later charged with fleeing the scene of an accident. Some reports say that Cary Stayner took his brother's death hard, while others claim that it didn't seem to affect him much at all.
The day after Christmas in 1990, tragedy hit the Stayner family yet again. Cary's uncle, 42-year-old Cary Stayner, clocked out of work on December 26th, not knowing it would be the last time. He worked as a dispatcher at Levitt's Trucking Incorporated. This was supposed to be a quick break. Jerry was just heading home for lunch, fully intending to return to work when he was done. No one knows exactly what happened, but he never made it back out of his house. A friend living in the neighborhood was passing the house that afternoon and noticed that the door was open, which was odd. They stopped to check on Jerry and found him dead. He had been shot with his own shotgun in what looked like a burglary gone wrong. Cary was not home at the time, and no suspect has ever been identified in Jerry's murder.
Eventually, Cary ended up working for the Merced Glass and Mirror Company, doing glass repair and shower stall installations. His childhood friend, Mark Marchese, recalled that he once found Cary behind the glass company's building, punching pieces of plywood. Cary told Mark that he felt he was having a mental breakdown, and he shared a violent fantasy with him. Mark told ABC News he stated that he felt like jumping in a truck, driving it through the shop, and killing the boss, and killing everybody in the office, and then torching the place. Mark was disturbed by what Cary had told him, and he tried to convince Cary to get professional help before warning Cary's boss at the glass company. When the boss found out what Cary had said, he drove Cary personally to a mental health clinic where he received counseling. The next time Cary went to work, he picked up his paycheck and left, never returned.
All right, I got to be honest with you. That would be a little tough for me to continue to work with that individual who had just told me they felt like killing everyone in the shop. Okay, well, that includes me if I'm that person hearing the story. Now, some people might not take it seriously. They might say, oh, this person's just venting. But I don't know. Nowadays, I think you got to take all that stuff very seriously. And it sounds like they did back then, too.
Well, to this person's credit, they did the right thing. They warned the glass factory boss, and even the glass factory boss, he could have shunned him. He could have said, "You're fired. We don't want you here." he tried to get Cary help and personally drove him to a mental health facility. So it wasn't like they didn't try and help him to get some kind of assistance.
Yeah, it's a good point, because in a lot of episodes, we talked about people hearing, something similar, something along these lines, that someone is having issues, they're thinking about doing something, and they do kind of blow it off, and they never tell anybody. But that didn't happen in this case. Cary's mental health continued to deteriorate. At some point in 1991, when he was 30 years old, Cary tried to take his own life using carbon monoxide. This attempt was not successful, but it doesn't appear that he received any treatment until 4 years later, when he went to the Merced County Department of Mental Health and told them he was having a breakdown. He was briefly admitted for treatment before being released. In March of 1997, Cary was arrested during a raid of his friend's home. He was taken into custody for possession of methamphetamines and marijuana, but the charges were dropped shortly after. According to sfgate.com, investigators said that Cary was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
A few months later, Cary was hired at the Cedar Lodge, a motel in El Portal, California, just 7 miles from the entrance of Yosemite Park. It had been 8 years since Steven's death. The motel was right outside of Yosemite National Park, which Cary had loved to visit since he was a teen. He had been there many times before being hired at the Cedar Lodge. He would spend time in the park alone, naked, smoking marijuana in nature. It was the place he truly found peace. Working just miles from the park was a dream for him. He managed to stay out of trouble, and he was a reliable worker for 2 years. He was even dating one of the waitresses at the Cedar Lodge restaurant, and her 2 young daughters loved to spend time with him.
Morf, you ever get naked and smoke marijuana out in nature?
I can't say I have. How about you?
No, I do not remember ever doing that at all.
I mean, it sounds like a peaceful thing. He's not bothering anybody. If nobody's around, it's not really indecent, but just never partook in that.
I guess it's the naked part that gets me. I'm not sure why you need to be naked. Maybe that makes you closer to nature. I don't know. In February of 1999, Carol's son took her 15-year-old daughter, Juliana, and Juliana's close friend, 16-year-old Silvina Pelosa, on a sightseeing road trip. Around the same time, Cary decided it was time to act on his urges. And unfortunately for the 3 women, they would cross paths with Cary Stayner. On February 15th, Carol, Juliana, and Silvina hiked in Yosemite National Park, seeing the redwoods and taking it all in. Silvina was visiting from Argentina, so it was fun for the girls to spend time together no matter what they were doing. But this was a special trip. They were trying to pack in as much fun and sightseeing for Silvina as possible. They had been to San Francisco. They'd gone to Disneyland, and they were finishing up with seeing the giant ancient redwood forest.
That same day, Cary went to the house of his girlfriend, where she lived with her 2 young daughters. His plan was to play out his sick fantasies of control before killing his girlfriend and her daughters. Due to the slow winter season, Cary had been temporarily laid off from the Cedar Lodge, giving him all the time in the world to plot and cover his tracks. According to ABC News, Cary Stayner would later admit to investigators, "The girl I was seeing and her daughters were my original intended targets." But once he arrived at their house, there was someone near the home. He wasn't expecting this, and it spooked him, so he drove off. His girlfriend and her daughters had no idea how lucky they were.
And there's a couple of things that, go through my mind regarding this. And we've seen it before. First of all, it's going to come out at some point that you were dating this horrible monster, and you let this monster in your home around your daughters. That has to be extremely frightening when the person finds out. But then to find out that you came very, very close to losing your life and your daughters losing their lives. I don't know how you deal with that.
And for his part, it doesn't seem like Cary was thinking things through. Maybe he's just acting on impulse, but it's only logical that had he killed his girlfriend and her daughters. As someone that was dating her, he would certainly be at the top of the suspect list. So I don't know what his plan was if he had gone through with it.
After a day in Yosemite National Park, Carol, Juliana, and Sylvina went back to the motel and started to settle in. First, they ate dinner at the restaurant there. They also rented a few movies from the front desk before heading to their room for the night. As Cary came back to the Cedar Lodge, feeling unfulfilled and disappointed that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her daughters, he saw the trio. Carol, Juliana, and Sylvina were in their motel room with the curtains open. Cary spied into the room, and he decided it wasn't too late to carry out a version of his plan, only this plan was with 3 different victims than he had intended. A knock on the door surprised the 3 inside, and they opened it. Stayner, now getting an even better look inside the room, identified himself as the maintenance worker for the lodge. He claimed that the room above them had a leak and that he needed access to their room to check on it. At first, they turned him away. It's not clear if they had a bad feeling about him or just felt inconvenienced. But Cary put on an act to put them at ease and said there was no problem. He would get the manager in return once they felt better about it. At this point, they told Stayner he could come in. It was a decision that would cost them their lives.
As soon as the room's door closed behind him, Cary pulled out his .22 caliber revolver. Immediately, all 3 of them, Carol, Juliana, and Sylvina, were compliant. As he gagged each of them and bound their hands with duct tape, Cary claimed he was there to rob them and that he would leave when he was done. He pushed Juliana and Sylvina into the bathroom and turned his attention to Carol, who was face down on one of the beds. He got on top of her and strangled her using a small length of rope he brought with him. After he was sure she was dead, he took her body out to the parking lot and placed her into the trunk of her own rental car. Back inside the motel room, he took each girl out of the bathroom and put them on one of the beds. He sexually assaulted both of them for some time before getting angry that they wouldn't cooperate with him. He would also later confess that he had been unable to maintain an erection, which also began to irritate him. He took Sylvina into the bathroom and strangled her. Just like Carol, he put her in the trunk of the rental car.
Stayner put Juliana, the last one alive, in the car and drove off. Over an hour later, he pulled over to a spot overlooking the Don Pedro Reservoir near Moccasin Point. He pulled Juliana out of the car and carried her to some bushes where he planned to sexually assault her again before killing her. According to the New York Daily News, Cary likened the way he carried her to a groom carrying his bride over the threshold. After he raped Juliana, he slit her throat so deeply she was nearly decapitated and left her there. He drove Carol's son's rented Pontiac about 30 miles to a forest in Tuolumne County. He pulled off onto a logging road and ended up getting the car stuck. So he just left it and walked about 2 miles to a highway market in Sonora. So no doubt that's a lot to take in. I mean, this was a very brutal act, 3 brutal murders. And I thought that Cary's quote to the New York Daily News was sickening. You know, he said he carried her like a groom carrying his bride over the threshold. Well, that's a very joyous occasion. You've just gotten married, you're in love. Everyone can picture that in a happy way. How is he equating that to what he's doing to this young girl? It's sick.
And it's also pretty interesting that the first time he shows rage and acts out on his fantasies, he manages to do all this with 3 victims, which seems pretty difficult for one person to abduct and murder 3 different women. Yet that was his first violent offense that we know of. He didn't work up to it and get better at it. He just, right from the get-go, decided he was going to abduct and kill 3 women.
Well, you said that we know of, and I think that's an important point. We don't know. what he might have done before this. Maybe nothing. Maybe you're right. This was his first murders. But the other thing that I can't help but think about is the fear that, the three of them must have been going through.
Yeah, it had to be extremely frightening, especially since they had to know there was no way he was going to let them go once all this started, because they knew he worked there and it would be easy to identify him. So it was probably going through their minds that he's not going to let them go.
Well, and especially for the two younger girls, once he killed Carol and they would have known that, and then obviously Sylvina is killed. I mean, Juliana, I can't even imagine what was going through her mind, but she had to have been thinking that she was going to be killed as well. And sadly she was.
Once at the highway market in Sonora, after getting the car stuck at around 10 a.m., Cary Stayner called for a cab to Yosemite Lodge. The nearly 2-hour drive cost Cary $125. Along the way, he spoke to the driver, Jenny Horvath, about many things, including his encounters with Bigfoot. He also took a short nap while they drove. When they got to the gates of Yosemite, Cary bickered with a park employee, refusing to pay the $35 vehicle entrance fee. This behavior, coupled with the odd talk of Bigfoot, cemented Cary in Jenny's memory. He wasn't just a fare anymore. He was the kind of customer she called her husband about because it felt so weird. She told RecordNet.com, "I just thought that it was strange because he seems like a normal guy." And later she talked to SFGate.com saying he wanted to show me where he saw Bigfoot.
Well, first of all, $125 cab ride back then, that's a boatload of money, but it's a 2-hour drive. I don't know what that would cost today, because I swear, Morf, to take a cab from any airport to a hotel 5 minutes away costs an arm and a leg.
Yeah, that sounds like a steep price.
But then you have, this talk about Bigfoot. And I'm sure cab drivers hear all kinds of strange things. It's probably one of the interesting things about being a cab driver. But, you have this guy talking about Bigfoot, that he has seen Bigfoot, and even wanting to show her exactly where he saw her. Yeah, that's going to stick in your mind, I think, for a while.
Yeah, and for the Bigfoot believers, that is Bigfoot country where they were at. A lot of sightings out there. So if he was going to see Bigfoot, it was probably in that area that he would claim to have seen him.
That evening, Jen's son waited for his wife, Carol, daughter, Juliana, and her friend, Sylvina, at the airport in San Francisco, where they were all supposed to meet up. They were going to fly to Arizona. The ladies would see the Grand Canyon while he went on some business meetings. Thinking they flew without him, he continued on the trip. The next day, when they still weren't in Arizona, he called the police. 2 days after Stayner killed Carol, he went back to her abandoned rental car to retrieve her wallet and cover up evidence by lighting the car on fire. He then drove to Modesto and dumped Carol's wallet.
That same day, a search was launched for the 3 missing tourists. Investigators combed through their motel room but found no sign of a struggle. Along with other lodge employees, they questioned Cary Stayner briefly, but found him to be unsuspicious and helpful. He let them into various rooms to search and answered all of their questions. There were other employees at the lodge with relevant criminal histories that caught the eye of investigators over Cary Stayner. With no bodies and no answer to what actually happened, investigators were unable to make enough of a case to arrest anyone for any crimes related to the 3 missing women.
On March 18th, 1999, Jim Powers discovered an abandoned car as he was heading into the forest to do some target shooting. It had been burned, but he still recognized it from the news coverage. It was the formerly red Pontiac Grand Prix that Carol's son rented and never returned. Now it was about 100 yards off Highway 108, abandoned and completely destroyed. He left and summoned police to the scene. The next day, investigators searching the car found 2 bodies in the trunk. They had been badly burned by the fire and had to be identified using dental records. It was a slow process, but the bodies were positively identified as Silvina Peloso and Carol Sund. Juliana was still missing. Investigators had hope that she was still alive and being held somewhere.
After a week with no sign of Juliana Sund, the FBI office received an anonymous letter and map leading right to her. Someone had drawn a map of Highway 120 and Don Pedro Reservoir. A trail started at the highway and ended at an X on the edge of the reservoir, labeled Vista Point. According to CBS News, the note included with the map read, "We had fun with this one." On March 25th, investigators following the trail discovered Juliana's body with the help of a cadaver dog. Her body was wrapped in a pink blanket from the Cedar Lodge.
Well, it kind of goes back to this new podcast you're starting, more this killer communications. Anytime you have somebody, a killer or something like that, who is reaching out with some type of communication, it's fascinating to me why they feel the need to do that. But I would think it would be impossible for law enforcement not to believe that whoever sent the letter and drew the map was the killer. I mean, just the note, "We had fun with this one." As sadistic as it is, it kind of points to who else being able to do this but the killer.
Yeah, and being that the map led directly to her body, somebody that wasn't the killer wouldn't know exactly where her remains would be found. So it had to be clear to investigators that whoever sent that map had to have knowledge of where her body would be found.
It's very possible that if Cary hadn't gone on to kill again, that he would never have been suspected in the murders of the 3 tourists. He might have gotten away with it all. Investigators weren't treating the murders as a cold case. They had suspects they thought were good for this crime. Suspects who had actually confessed. Authorities initially looked into 4 men from the Modesto area. First, Carol's wallet had been found in Modesto, so suspects from that area seemed obvious. Additionally, the crime seemed too complicated for one person to have been responsible, especially with 3 victims. Multiple suspects would have been able to easily overpower the 3 victims and do it quickly, explaining why no one saw anything suspicious. The map did say "we" as well, so police were locked in on finding a group of men that had committed this terrible triple murder.
The 4 men police suspected were already in jail on unrelated charges and had extensive criminal histories. Investigators even believed that fiber evidence from the crime scene linked these men to the murders. They were so sure that the FBI announced they had their suspects and that the public was safe. Their main suspect, Eugene Dykes, who went by Rufus, had been released from prison on parole just 1 month before the murders, and he was arrested on a parole violation before their bodies were found. His half-brother, Michael Larwick, to police, this overreaction might have been the result if he thought he was being pulled over and arrested for triple murder.
One of the versions of the story Rufus told investigators involved him killing Carol Sund and his half-brother Michael killing Juliana and Silvina. But his half-brother adamantly denied any involvement and even volunteered to give a DNA sample so that he could be ruled out. According to the LA Times, while there were many inconsistencies in his story, including entirely different versions of what happened, investigators believed he was trying to confuse people, trying to save himself from retribution in prison, and also trying to get the blame off him and onto his brother. Rufus later recanted his confession. And I can understand why police would kind of, zero in on these individuals. And they obviously were not good guys. You had one person just being, released from prison. You've got his half brother shooting a police officer during a traffic stop. And the thinking there being, why would he be so fearful of being captured? Well, maybe it's because he was involved in this triple murder. But as is always the case where people confess to things they haven't done, you have to ask some questions. The first one being, why would someone do that? And we don't know exactly why, We don't know how much pressure was being applied by police. We don't know what their interrogation tactics were. Were they solid? Were they over the line? Have no idea. But this is kind of interesting to me because you have one person implicating themselves and their half-brother, but the half-brother vehemently denying any type of involvement.
Yeah, I think when he started saying, hey, I'll give my DNA to prove I didn't do this, I imagine the investigators probably had to pump the brakes at that point and say, wait a minute, if this guy's willing to give us DNA, maybe he isn't involved. As investigators tried to get the truth from the wrong suspects, Cary Stayner was free to kill again. On July 21st, 1999, he went to Yosemite National Park. He drove down Foresta Road looking for an area where he believed he had once encountered Bigfoot. This time, he saw 26-year-old Joey Armstrong, a naturalist who taught children's classes at the park. According to the article, The Case of a Lifetime by Stacy Finns, when Cary eventually confessed to Joey's murder, he said, I can't tell you why this happened. One minute I'm thinking great thoughts and world peace, and the next minute, it looks like I could kill every person on the face of the earth. According to him, the victims were just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Joey Armstrong was living her dream. She loved nature and was able to live in a national park. According to the LA Times, days before she was killed, she emailed a friend about how much she loved where she was living, saying, I love the big meadow with all its daisies and incredible history. Also love my garden and living in Yosemite, one of the most beautiful places in the whole wide world. Being in Yosemite is probably very far from what Joey would have described as the wrong place. To her, she was in the right place. When Stayner saw her, she was walking back and forth from her cabin as she packed up her car for a trip. No one was helping her, and she didn't seem to be talking to anyone. Cary could tell that she was alone. He struck up a conversation with her before pulling out his gun and telling her he was just going to rob her. He forced her into the cabin where, after struggling with Joey, he used duct tape to cover her mouth and bind her arms. While trying to subdue Joey, Cary left his fingerprints in her cabin.
Cary pulled Joey into his truck, leaving his footprints near her cabin. He intended to take her far away to sexually assault her, but despite being bound and gagged, she climbed through the open window and jumped as he was driving. After falling from Cary's moving truck, Joey tried to run, but he was easily able to catch up to her. Instead of trying to get her back into the truck, Cary decided to kill her on the spot. He pulled out a knife and held it to her neck. When he slit her throat, she was helplessly bound with duct tape, unable to move her arms, but she still tried to fight. She put her chin to her chest in an attempt to block her neck. Cary had to cut her throat multiple times to kill her, dragging her further into the forest as they struggled.
And I'm struck, Morf, by just, how vicious of an attack this one was as well. But also by the way that Joey put up a fight. She really tried hard to defend herself and save her life.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. She, probably knew that this wasn't going to end well. She had nothing to lose by trying to fight back, and she did everything she could, but unfortunately it wasn't enough.
Joey put up such a fight against Cary that even he was worried that he had made a mistake, and he was right to be worried because he had. He realized that attacking her was a mistake. According to Newsweek, Stayner would later tell FBI agents, as soon as I killed her, I knew I was going to get caught. He dragged Joey's body to the edge of a creek and tried to hide the large trail of blood with pine needles, but quickly gave up and decided to decapitate her. He thought about keeping her head as some kind of trophy, but instead decided to place it in a nearby stream. When Joey didn't meet up with her friends out of town and her roommates discovered that she never even left, a search began. Her body was found about 1.5 miles away from her cabin, headless.
A U.S. Park Service firefighter told investigators about a truck that had been parked near Joey's cabin during the suspected time of her murder. It was a very unique blue and white 1979 International Scout. Cary Stayner was known to drive this exact vehicle. The day after Joey's murder, investigators found Stayner sitting near the Merced River, smoking a joint. They began to question him about Joey's murder, and Stayner denied being anywhere near the area of her cabin the day before. He allowed investigators to search his truck, but not his backpack, which worried them since Joey's head was still missing at the time. The sheriff's deputy did issue a citation for the weed and seized his backpack, but left without taking Cary into custody.
The next day, Cary Stayner didn't show up to work, which was suspicious for him, but especially odd in the middle of this investigation. They managed to track him down at the Laguna del Sol nudist resort, about 2 hours north of Yosemite, after a guest called police because they recognized his name from a news report. Cary was easy to find at the nudist resort, since he was the only person still clothed. His truck wasn't just unique because it was uncommon, he also had different brands of tires on it, making the tracks left outside of Joey Armstrong's cabin incredibly damning when they were a match to his vehicle. He was taken into custody for questioning. We talked about him smoking weed in the forest nude earlier. I just thought it was so odd that he makes the decision to go to this nudist resort. I mean, I don't know if this guy had a thing with nudity, but obviously he wasn't nude on this day because people said he stood out. He was the only one wearing clothes.
And maybe he went there with the intention of trying to blend in and hide, but if anything, he probably drew attention to himself for not being a nudist.
Yeah, normally you would think someone being nude would be the person who stands out. But if you're at a nudist resort, the person with their clothes still on is going to be the one that stands out.
Cary Stayner made a few requests before he agreed to speak to investigators. The police stomachs turned and they became angry as Stayner made his demands known. According to A&E TV, Stayner requested to have what he called pictures of little girls and what one FBI agent would call child pornography. He also wanted to be in federal custody, not state custody, in the facility nearest to Merced where his family was. Finally, he wanted the reward put up by Carlson's parents to go to his family. He also wanted a movie made about his life like his brother Steven got. It was no surprise that the investigators told him to go pound sand over these demands.
Despite not having his demands met, Stayner began to open up about his crimes. There's no way to know how long Juliana would have remained missing if Stayner hadn't given them a map that led to her body in a CBS News interview. According to former FBI Special Agent Jeffrey Rennick, who eventually got Cary Stayner to confess. He said it was bothering him that Julie's body was laying out there in the elements and not being found, and he wanted her to be found. However, John Boyles, another FBI agent on the case, in an ABC News interview, remembered that when Cary Stayner confessed, there didn't seem to be any real emotion there. According to Boyles, Stayner rattled off the details of the murders as if he was reading a soup label. And that doesn't surprise me at all. Morf, when you talk about some of these types of killers, one of the commonalities that a lot of them have is the lack of emotion.
Yeah, it's hard to get in the minds of some of these people that do these things. On one hand, he's emotionless, but on the other hand, it seemed as if he was worried that this girl's body had been laying out there not being found, and it bothered him. So kind of strange to have them, on one hand, be upset about something like that. On the other hand, not be worried about it at all and not show any emotion over it.
Yeah, it's a strange dichotomy for sure.
Cary Stayner was charged with the abductions and murders of all 4 women, Carol and Juliana Sund, Silvina Peloso, and Joey Armstrong. He initially claimed that he only killed his victims and said that there had been no sexual assault. He tried to paint the murders as fast, painless, and almost merciful. Eventually, he came clean and admitted to sexually assaulting Juliana and Silvina. This was no false confession. A fingerprint on the stamp used to send the anonymous map and letter showing where Juliana was located matched Cary Stayner's print. Because Joey Armstrong was killed in a national park, Cary Stayner was first going to be tried in federal court and would be eligible for the death penalty. He decided to plead guilty to receive life in prison instead in Joey's murder, but for whatever reason, he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity for the other 3 murders. This meant that he wasn't claiming that someone else killed the 3, just that he shouldn't be sent to prison for it because he wasn't in his right mind. He was also eligible for the death penalty at his trial, but risked it anyway.
Prosecutors made it clear that Cary Stayner was cold, cunning, and calculated, but they didn't have a slam dunk case against him. Investigators weren't even sure where his first 3 victims had been abducted from, and they had no idea that 2 of them had been killed in the motel room, despite that room having been searched. All signs pointed to the women leaving the motel and meeting their unfortunate fate sometime after this. Cary had deliberately left wet towels in the room to make it look like the 3 had gotten ready for their next day before heading out. To confuse investigators, making it even harder to figure out where they were actually abducted from, Cary made sure to cross county lines before dropping Carol's wallet in Modesto, 80 miles away from the Cedar Lodge. And when he sent that map leading investigators to Juliana's body, he paid a child $5 to lick the stamp and envelope for him so that if he did get questioned, his DNA wouldn't match. But Stayner made the mistake of leaving his own fingerprint on that stamp. So even though his DNA wasn't on it, his print was.
The prosecution argued that since Cary Stayner took steps to avoid detection and purposefully tried to throw off investigators, that none of that is the work of someone out of touch with reality. He very clearly knew what he was doing was wrong and tried very hard to get away with it, and he wasn't insane. After a 3-month trial, the jury decided that they did not believe any excuse of mental illness or insanity. Cary Stayner was not only convicted by the jury, but they recommended that he be sentenced to death. The judge granted the jury's wish and sentenced Cary Stayner to death in the other 3 murders. Family members of his victims also didn't believe that mental illness had anything to do with the murders. Jen's son, Juliana's father, said in court at sentencing, "I know he has no trouble killing little girls in the middle of the night. I just wish he could step up and take his punishment now."
And I bet you if Jens was being, brutally honest, he would say, not only do I wish, Cary would be put to death right now, but I'd like to be the one to do it. I think a lot of fathers in that situation would have that thought.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common feeling for those kinds of dads in that situation. He was saying all this to the judge just feet away from Cary Stayner.
Oh, and I'm sure he had, as some people do, the thought or the idea of, if I could just get to this guy, if I could jump over the railing and get to this guy. And some people have actually done it and had to have been separated. For their part, the Stayner family did not think that Cary deserved a death sentence. His father, Delbert, said in court if he'd gotten help, there would be 4 people alive today. Cary Stayner would tell KBWB TV, "I'm sorry their loved ones were where they were, when they were. I wish I could have controlled myself and not done what I did." While he was awaiting trial, Cary had written a letter to one of his victims, Juliana Sund, trying to show remorse. According to the LA Times, the letter read in part, "I'm just sorry that you were there when the years of fantasizing my darkest dreams became a reality in the flesh." Of the apologetic letter, Juliana's grandmother, Carol Carrington, said it was a non-apology apology. Like, it was their fault. I think it was the poorest example of an apology I've ever heard. In the end, most people thought that Cary Stayner's apologies was just a case of crocodile tears. And I think I would feel the exact same way. I'm just sorry that these 3 individuals were where they were. It's like, that is such a strange apology. If that's what you're trying to do, I get it. You're saying they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were, but you're in some ways kind of putting it on them. It's their fault they were there. I just happened to come along.
Yeah, not accepting any responsibility at all or having any genuine remorse. Not saying, I've thought about this and I know I was wrong. I should have never done this. I'm so sorry to the families. He's just nonchalantly saying, well, they weren't there when it happened. News of the conviction of Cary Stayner for these horrible crimes once again brought his brother Steven's name into the spotlight. People couldn't believe that one could be a hero and one a cold-blooded killer. Sadly, to this day, when many people hear the last name Stayner, they think of the murderer's Cary Stayner and not the heroic Steven. One took 4 lives, and the other bravely saved his own and that of another young boy.
As a result of the conviction and the realization that Cary Stayner was a cold-blooded killer, both investigators and family were looking back on his uncle Jerry Stayner's murder in a new light. While they had never thought he could have been involved in killing his uncle, now they weren't so sure. Cary's cousin, Ronnie Jones, told Time magazine, "The only reason I could figure him doing it is if our uncle knew something about him." Going on to explain the only reason that would make sense is that he had maybe killed someone else. And there are people that do believe that Cary Stayner could have killed other people. Some of the cases people have tried to connect him to are as follows. 28-year-old Patricia Dahlstrom. She moved to Merced from Washington. In September 1982, she vanished soon after. According to her roommate, Patricia was headed to Yosemite Park. In 1983, a human arm and hand were found in the park. 5 years later, in 1988, a skull was found close to the other parts. Years later, genealogy would prove that all of these body parts belonged to Patricia. What connected Patricia possibly to Cary Stayner was she had been a member of what has been described as a cult-like church. And the cult's leader, Donald Gibson, was friends with Cary Stayner.
In October 1994, a set of human hands was found near the New Malone's Reservoir. 2 months later, a headless and handless torso was found off Camp 9 Road near Vallecito. In December 1995, those body parts were identified as being those of 24-year-old Sherilyn Mavone Murphy. She had vanished from Sacramento in September 1994 after going to a doctor's appointment. Stayner was suspected in her case because the dismembering is very similar to the dismembering of his victim, Joey Armstrong.
Police have also considered the possibility that Cary Stayner may be connected to the case of 34-year-old Denise Smith. Her body was found in an old burn barrel near Don Pedro Reservoir in December 1994. It's not clear exactly why police thought that Cary may have been responsible for Denise's death, other than the proximity and time frame.
Finally, 20-year-old Michael Larry Madden was thought to be a possible victim of Stayner's. He vanished in August 1996 after failing to meet up with some friends to do some fishing and camping. He was supposed to meet his friends at the Sandbar Flat Campground in the Stanislaus National Forest near Sonora, but he never showed. He's been missing to this day. And again, it's not clear why police think Michael Madden could be one of Stayner's victims, other than proximity to his hunting grounds. But one thing's for sure, that Michael Madden, a man, was not the typical victim Cary Stayner searched for.
But it never surprises me more when you talk about a guy like Cary Stayner, knowing what he did do. It's pretty easy to think that he was capable of other murders. He was probably responsible for other murders. And, you start to look at cases that happened around the areas where he was known to have been in the time that he was known to have been there. And you have to wonder, was he responsible for some of these? And the answer is likely yes. Now, maybe not these exact ones, but if not these, others that people haven't connected. It's just hard for me to believe that a guy like Cary Stayner, with the fantasies he had, probably didn't act on them sooner. Let's not forget, he was 30 years old. A lot of killers don't wait until they're 30 years old to start. But it's also not like most killers offer up all of their details, right? If police don't ask them about them, if they're not on police radar, why would someone just say, oh yeah, well, let me tell you about all these other ones as well? And I think it's safe to say, right? Cary Stayner could be connected to any or all of these cases, or maybe to none of them. But you can't blame the authorities for considering him in these cases because, like I said, he's proven to be a deadly killer. So any victims that turned up in the area, he operated in and around during that time he was active, could possibly be one of his victims. To date, there just isn't any evidence that connects Cary Stayner to any murders other than the 4 he's been found guilty of.
Cary Stayner, now 63 years old, is currently housed at Pelican Bay State Prison in Santa Clara County, California. His record still states he is condemned to death, but there's been a moratorium on executions in the state of California since 2006. It's unlikely that he will be executed anytime soon, if at all. To this day, the Stayner name continues to elicit strong memories and emotions from those familiar with the two brothers, Steven for his bravery and heroic actions, and Cary for his terrible and horrible deeds.
And as we wrap up this case, Morf, I think what you just said is what, makes this case so fascinating to many. Obviously, as we detailed out, Cary Stayner committed some horrible murders. And on his own, he would be an infamous killer. But he's made more infamous by the fact that, his brother Steven was abducted and then reunited with the family after he saved another young boy. He became this hero. They made the movie about him. So you have that contrast of the two brothers, one heroic and one murderous. And I think for me, one of the big questions in this case is, what role did Steven's abduction play in the formation of Cary's murderous thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that it played some role. It didn't help for sure. But according to him, he was having those fantasies even before Steven was abducted. So, even if Steven had never been abducted, it seems like Cary could have gone on to do crimes like this.
Yeah, it's very likely that he would have been a murderer either way. But like you said, it couldn't have helped because, we talked about the feelings he had that kind of emanated from his brother's abduction. His parents focusing a lot of their attention on Steven, which how could they not? They have a missing child. But the other thing I think you have to look at is he had other siblings who went through the same thing. They didn't turn out to be murderers. And so, it's a fascinating case to me when you look at it from all those different angles. There had to be something in Cary.
Yeah, and it's frightening to think of how many victims he might have had he not slipped up and made the mistakes he did. He seems like somebody that probably would have just gotten better at what he was doing and thought of more ways to commit those killings and get away with them, and might have had a much higher victim count. And he, as we mentioned, he may still have more victims that just haven't been connected to him because of a lack of physical evidence.
Yeah, and the one thing that we haven't talked about is if you look at pictures of Cary Stayner from back during that time, he was a pretty good looking guy. A lot of people have pointed that out. So we're not talking about a scary kind of boogeyman type figure here. This is not the Henry Lee Lucas. This is not the Otis Toole, the person who would scare you as soon as you see them. This is a guy who a lot of women were attracted to. So then you're in the area of more of a Ted Bundy, where, it would have been easier for a guy like Cary Stayner maybe to get closer to his victims, to get them to let their guard down, because he was a pretty good looking guy.
And not just that, but he also had credentials being, the motel staff worker. He had legitimate reasons for being in locations where he was. And, if he showed his ID to someone, they, probably would let their guard down the way that, his first 3 victims did by letting him come into their hotel room.
Well, the one thing I know for sure is that he was a bad guy. He was a horrible, horrible killer. No doubt about it. But that's it for our episode on Cary Stayner. And really, it was kind of a 2-parter. First part on Steven and then the second part on Cary. But if you love the show and you haven't done so yet, go out, give us a rating, leave a review. Also, keep telling your friends. Word of mouth about the podcast really helps us out.
If you want to find us on social media, we're on X with the handle @CriminologyPod. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/CriminologyPodcast. And you can join our Facebook discussion group, Criminology Podcast Discussion and Fans.
So that's it for another episode of Criminology, but Morf and I will be back with all of you next Saturday night with a brand new episode. So until then, for Mike
and Morf,
we'll talk to you next week.
Take care, everyone.